It's a new decade, so what better time to take a look at the low end of the market by starting this week off with a look at AMD's cheapest graphics card offering. This right here is the £7 or $10 Radeon. The Radeon in question being a used AMD Terascale Terra, the HD6870, which is definitely quite a mouthful to say. It's a card we've actually seen before on the channel, but it was the second video I ever made, and was so terrible that we're not even going to talk about it. The benchmarks are about the only thing useful in it, and even then they are from a few years ago now. But either way, it seemed like a mediocre purchase back then that was only bought to replace my friend's graphics card. However, this card now costs a third of what it did back then, and is very cheap to get a hold of. Featuring 1120 stream processors, 1 whole gigabyte of GDDR5 VRAM, and a release date nearing 10 years ago, it certainly was a formidable card when it came out back then, because it did most things you wanted it to. Consuming on average 145 watts, all the while running on AMD's 40nm Terascale 2 architecture, it actually sounds like it's pretty decent. The main issue nowadays is driver support, given that this card saw its final release of drivers just about 4 years ago, and the last stable release before those is nearing 5 years old, with AMD not exactly getting a great reputation for the state they left these cards in and the cards that came before them. But we aren't paying that much for it, so there's only so much we can complain when this card is selling for well under $15 in most territories, because no one wants them. But are those people wrong to not want these cards? Before we get straight into the benchmarks, this card was purchased quite cheaply from an eBay auction, which is the best way to get a hold of these cards, at least in my experience, although I've noticed a few locally for quite cheap as well. And they do tend to need cleaning up because they are old cards at this point, and most people selling them aren't going to have done anything to them. So you need a little bit of thermal paste if you're buying these types of things. But while we changed all that, why don't we talk a little bit about the card's history? So buckle up as we're heading back a decade to the year of 2010. Hot on the heels of the new DirectX 11 trend, that's right, that was actually new back then, AMD had been pretty successful with their Radeon HD 5000, beating Nvidia to the post by releasing it before their GTX 400 series, which I'm pretty sure we all remember for being very hot and heavy. The thing is that the 5000 series saw a lot of success because of this, and it also saw them being a bit cocky going forward because there was a bit of confusion over what the new 6000 series was following on from this. See, on the high end, the HD6950 cards and upwards, they were all pretty new and genuinely not a bad purchase. But on the lower end and the mid-range, namely this card here, it was an optimised re-release, with reference designs performing noticeably worse than their previous HD 5000 variants, leaving them with a bit of a sour reputation in consumers' minds. To condense the story down as much as I can, the cards saw enough price cuts, and aftermarket cards were clocked high enough to remove any performance difference from most of the cards. All in all, another time where a rebrand serves nothing more than to confuse people, or at least that's how it would seem to most normal people. Still, a decent mid-range release well on a decade ago, and one that sold very well for AMD, meaning that now it saturates the low end of the market because most sane people want to upgrade. But for those of us with nothing more than the change in our back pocket looking to actually get a graphics card, this genuinely looks to be a compelling purchase, if it performs well. Today we are also going to be using my main PC to show the entire performance of the card, so don't worry, everything you'll be seeing is down to the card limiting us here, showing you the peak potential of what you can expect with a HD6870. And really though, I wasn't expecting much from this card. I kinda bought it expecting to, be a little bit harsh to it. But honestly, I think some of the results are going to surprise you, because I was really surprised by how such a cheap card that was abandoned by AMD is still holding up. CSGO is genuinely a much harder card to run nowadays than compared to how it was originally, so with medium settings mostly and the shadows turned on high, the game saw itself running really nicely, even with a HD resolution. Now, the card does actually have driver support on this game, so that would likely explain why it's running so well, and I wasn't expecting the card to fall down here. I mean, it did alright last time I tested it. There wasn't exactly much in the way of stuttering, so I would say you could definitely play competitively and have a good time on the card. and I wouldn't say you have to worry too much about performance issues, although if you turn up the resolution much more, the VRAM does get dangerously close to being used up with the newer map designs, but honestly for 720p and 900p it's absolutely fine, although with the ultra lowest settings you could probably manage. I'd imagine 1080p would run okay, just expect larger frame drops due to the smaller VRAM pool on the card. Another older title from 2015 running absolutely fantastically with GTA 5 with high textures and shaders, as well as anisotropic filtering and a few other settings turned up slightly from low. All in all though, that was the best way to play the game with 81 FPS on average, and this wasn't exactly your average lightweight benchmark. This is genuinely just me running around trying to cause havoc and play the game as much as I can, so you aren't going to see any drops below 60 FPS in my experience, unless you enter the menus, which could take some time to load, which might be down to some of those shader effects going on in the background when you open the pause menu. All in all, very strange to have that happen, and was the only issue I found with playing GTA 5 on this card. And, you know, it's running in HD resolutions for about a tenner. That is very good from a card like this. Now to start throwing the brand new titles at it, with Halo's Master Chief Collection running in full HD 1080p with the original settings also used on the Xbox One. I did also enable a 60 FPS cap to help smooth out the frame rate here or there, as really I'd rather have a capped 60 FPS than have the frame rate fluctuating all over the place, especially when the card was being optimized as well as it was. All in all though, the game played very much like the current generation consoles, just very smooth all round, with large explosions, vehicles and plenty going on around you, hardly causing any frame rate difference. Given there is no driver-side support at all for this one, it really did pique my interest into how well a lot of modern titles would fare with this card, given that the drivers have no way of knowing what they're running. With all the talk about modern titles, we have Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord, which is actually an early access game out at the moment, and one I picked up at release, but that's not what really matters. I found the game to be pretty well optimized for what it is, at least on the graphics side of things, especially when dealing with a large map and battles that were pretty large because I always set up a custom one for benchmarks, and providing you were using the lowered settings, aka the lowest settings on offer, you saw some really awesome performance. Albeit the game did look like the original Warband release, which is not a pretty game, but still, this is the full Bannerlord experience running with 60 FPS on a £10 graphics card. We aren't seeing consoles doing that at the moment. BeamNG, although a more CPU-driven title, does actually need a graphics card to push what's going on screen, and provided you don't mind lower settings, the game ran absolutely fine in full HD, and even on simpler maps you could see a very nice frame rate a lot of the time. But in heavy areas, it's true that the game could suffer quite a lot more heavily, especially in those densely populated towns and cities where there's a lot more textures being loaded in, and the card only has 1GB of VRAM. So if you felt like driving your Astra around the streets of Italy, there are chances you might want to drop that resolution slightly. But we did see a fully playable FPS well over 30, decent all in all for a £10 or $10 graphics card. Civ 6, although a CPU-driven game once again, only ran with lower settings and a lower resolution, which I was a little bit disappointed in. For some reason the game would eat through all of our 1GB of VRAM at anything much higher than 720p, although when you stuck around the 720p mark it ran pretty nicely, and that's honestly fine for a strategy game, as this is more about your CPU actually processing the turns more than anything. Generally I would have preferred to see better performance than this overall, but still it's not too bad, and you can definitely get into the latest and greatest from the genre for well under a tenner. Well, that's what I keep saying about this card, but still, it is true. Now feel free to call me insane here, but the last time I tested PUBG, if anyone actually still plays this game anymore, there was no hope in hell that this game would run at all on one of these cards. So props to the developers if they've actually gone and optimized this game, because we were seeing a fully playable experience with a lower settings and lower resolution combo. Although the game could be a little bit blurry at times, it didn't exactly make it unplayable. There were moments where the frame rate could also fluctuate, but never enough to make it unplayable, and usually the vehicles had the largest performance hit because of this. Generally, I was really amazed at how well this game was running, meaning I might want to start re-benchmarking it on certain bits of hardware to see if there has been some sort of improvement as the game has left early access. And then to round us off with the final game to test, I ran City Skylines on the card, which didn't run poorly at all. I will say that we were running in 1080p with lower settings and a few effects turned up to stop it looking too bad, as they didn't tend to tax the card much at all, and in the early game I was able to build a nice little city and saw no problems playing the game whatsoever. I could see the late game being a struggle on a card. Then again, if you're spending £10 or less on a graphics card, I'm imagining your system's going to have some other areas where it's going to fall down before this little HD6870 does. Now at this point you're probably thinking, wow, that performance is genuinely impressive. But this is AMD's Terascale, and as I mentioned earlier, some people called it Terror Scale, as in terrifying. Why, might you ask? Well, remember how I said AMD kind of abandoned these cards? Well, when you try and run certain titles, you run into some fun issues. For example, Shadow of the Tomb Raider technically runs with the final drivers that are stable, the WHQL ones. It just renders a black screen. That's it. You can fix this with the beta drivers, but in my experience those weren't very stable at all, and although they ran the benchmark, they would crash randomly in certain titles like that, and some games did work, they just didn't run all too well. Things like Doom run, but very poorly, as OpenGL support is mediocre to downright abysmal on these cards. And really, even for simpler titles like Minecraft, it is fine, but it should do a little bit better than it actually does. Not that it struggles, but it should do better. All in all, the performance is actually worse using the latest beta drivers on this card when I went back and ran through, so if you were going to buy this card, I'd genuinely stick with the final 15 point whatever release that they actually have on the AMD website, as they didn't actually crash once during my time testing them, unlike the beta drivers. And although a few newer titles do genuinely require the new drivers, they aren't going to run well anyway, so I wouldn't recommend going for them just to run the few titles that do require them. So, there we have it everyone, the HD6870, and you know what, for the price I am genuinely impressed. I did kind of buy this card, as I said earlier, thinking that with the state of the final Terascale drivers, it must be really suffering now in 2020. But in everything I could find to throw at it, it worked absolutely fine, other than, those few use cases where it straight up didn't do anything useful at all. But for well under a tenner, you can't really argue. Or can you? See, some of you might remember that I mentioned this was the AMD option. Well, next week, hopefully depending on postage, we're going to be finding out how well the Nvidia equivalent is holding up. And without giving too much away, it has great final drivers, DirectX 12 support, and cost me the exact same to buy. So we'll have to see how that holds up next week. Anyway, I hope this video was helpful to those of you trying to find a new graphics card right now. Good night. There we go, fellas. If you enjoyed this type of content, you can always like and subscribe for more, or dislike if you don't want to see graphics cards on a PC channel, and I would love to get one of these videos out every midweek, possibly, but we'll see how that goes.